what about life for those average settlers, the homesteaders who were living on the plains? Well, in fact, we find that life for them was also incredibly harsh and difficult during this time. The picture on the right gives you some sense of the challenges that these settlers encountered in simply surviving on the plains. We look in the background of that picture, and what we see is absolute desolation. There is not a tree, not a rock, not a stream in sight, and they are trying to survive in that kind of situation. So among the most severe problems that the settlers encountered was isolation. If you are settling in one of these 160-acre plots, you are miles and miles away from your closest neighbor and further still from the nearest city or town. We have many documents from particularly the women out there on the plains, and we can just imagine the woman here pushing this wheelbarrow, describing a process of incredible loneliness and isolation, leading in some cases to insanity. There are some of the diaries of these women that begin very coherently and upbeat, and by the end are simply rambling nonsense. And so there is the isolation. There is also a great lack of resources. Again, if we look at this picture, you see no trees, no water, or really anything of use in creating a settlement. You might be wondering what it is this woman is pushing around in the wheelbarrow, or if you've got a creative mind, you might have gathered already that what she is pushing are buffalo patties, as we call them. These would have been dried piles of manure. I suppose that conveys a sense of how desperate the situation was, but that was one thing out there on the plains that could actually be burned, and so she's probably going to burn these buffalo patties. There were also natural threats like grasshoppers, snakes, scorpions, ants, and all kinds of other creatures. I mentioned grasshoppers here on the PowerPoint slide merely because we might not think of grasshoppers as a great threat. And in the modern day, with pesticides and other things, the threat of grasshoppers is greatly diminished now from what it once was. But in this era, a swarm of grasshoppers could sweep through and devour an entire year's crop in a matter of minutes. And these swarms of grasshoppers would have numbered in perhaps the billions, certainly millions and millions of grasshoppers swarming over everything in their path. And we're talking about the big, intimidating 3 or 4 inch grasshoppers, not little tiny ones. I have a personal recollection, and I don't know if any of you might have encountered a swarm of grasshoppers, but even in this day and age, it's a very intimidating moment. I was on a family vacation as a young child in Montana or a similar place, and a swarm of grasshoppers descended. We were riding in the car, and I still remember to this day the sense of fear and terror as thousands of grasshoppers bounced off the windshield and bounced off the car, and the crunch of the tires on the road as we drove over thousands of these grasshoppers. So I can't imagine the sense of being out in the wild as millions of grasshoppers descend upon your home and everything else. Anyone who's watched the Weather Channel or traveled anywhere in the West understands that the weather strays from wild extremes. There are, of course, tornadoes, windstorms, and dust storms, incredibly heavy wind gusts, lightning strikes, and also incredibly bitter cold. At the same time, on the other end, there is drought and incredibly high temperatures in the summer. So on the whole, it presents just an incredibly harsh and forbidding landscape. It would have been a great challenge simply to survive in the midst of all of these natural perils. One other issue that confronted almost all of the homesteaders came to be debt. Now, the land itself was provided free and clear by the American government. But the settlers must have found that very quickly they realized they had to purchase supplies if, in fact, they were going to develop the land. And those who had virtually no money would have to borrow the money to buy perhaps even the wheelbarrow that you see in this picture, to buy the plows, to buy a mule or horses or other supplies. And they found themselves falling further and further into debt, an issue that they're going to have to work hard to resolve, and we will discuss in future lectures. This is a picture of a group of homesteading women that gives us further sense of the challenges that confronted the homesteaders during this period. First of all, we might wonder where the men in this picture are. They might have been cowboys off on the range somewhere, or perhaps they're out in their fields trying to get something to grow. But it is simply a fact, as I mentioned on the previous slide, that many of the women found themselves isolated while their men or husbands were away doing whatever it is that they were doing. We might also notice the house in the immediate background of this picture. If you look closely at that house and perhaps wonder to yourself, well, what is that made of? This would be called a sod house. And typically the first home that the settlers had to build was constructed essentially by digging into the ground. And you would dig down several inches and carve out yourself a nice chunk of sod. And you can see in the background they're not quite bricks. These are chunks of sod dug out from the ground. Now, fortunately, the grasses would have been in place for millennia, largely unchanged, and so the roots were very dense and solid. You could cut out a fairly solid chunk of dirt or sod. And so the home that you see in the background probably goes underground, several feet as well. So you're digging down, and you're also digging or building up the walls around that house. Nonetheless, we can imagine that this home would not have been the most pleasant place to be under even normal circumstances, but rainstorms and blizzards and floods and windstorms would surely have created great damage to a home of that sort. Homesteaders left on their own would have had an incredibly difficult time surviving in the wilderness of the Great Plains. And so we see they eventually begin to try to come together to combat these ills as one. And the organization that is established to aid them in this effort was called the Grange, the National Grange of the Patrons of Husbandry, which was founded by a man named Oliver H. Kelly in 1867. The Grange begins primarily as an agency to combat isolation and loneliness. Its primary function is a social one. Let's gather for meetings and dances and picnics and these sorts of things. But as the homesteaders began to gather at these informal meetings, they quickly began to discuss the other issues that plagued them, things like debt and combating the railroad, which is what you see suggested in this picture or cartoon at the right. The railroad was the bane of farmers' existence in the West because they could charge exorbitant rates for shipping and transportation and other things. And so the settlers begin discussing these kinds of political issues and gradually evolved into a political movement which becomes, by the 1870s and 80s, the Populist Party, a political party that will be a fairly prominent third party in the country for much of the period that we are discussing in the first few lectures in this course. And we will, in fact, discuss the Populist Party itself in a future lecture.